Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the mechanism of hormone release from the posterior pituitary. And so the cells that are involved here are called neurosecretory cells. These are neurons, specialized neurons. You'll see the cell bodies of those neurons up in that green portion embedded in the hypothalamus, and they send axons down that stalk called the infundibulum between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And so let's take a look at how this works. So the first thing that happens is that neurosecretory cells produce ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. And these hormones are represented by the green dots. So they'll produce them in the cell bodies, and as you can see, these hormones will actually travel down the axons to the axon endings. So when it's appropriate, when the situation calls for it, ADH and oxytocin are secreted from axon endings into the bloodstream. So let's take a look at the axon endings. Here you can see ADH and oxytocin, and they get produced into the bloodstream. So what's going to happen there is once they're in the bloodstream, they're going to be able to affect specific tissues, cells, and organs that have the receptors for these hormones. So you can see here that kidney tubules have receptors for antidiuretic hormone. What that's going to do is it's going to cause them to retain water. And we'll see more detail on this mechanism a little later on in this PowerPoint. What we'll also see later is how smooth muscle is affected in the uterus by oxytocin. So basically what it'll do is it will increase the force and the frequency of muscular contractions in the uterus during childbirth. What oxytocin will also do is it will also cause something called milk letdown. This is not the same as milk production, but what it'll do is it'll transport milk after it's been produced by the mammary glands to the surface of the skin. So that's what oxytocin is going to do. So now we're going to take a look at hormone release from the anterior pituitary. And so we're not looking at the green cells this time, we're looking at the yellow cells this time. And this is a completely different mechanism of hormone release. And so the first thing that's going to happen is that the neurosecretory cells are going to produce hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibiting hormones. And so the hypothalamic releasing hormones are going to instruct the pituitary gland to release its hormones, or different cells in the pituitary gland to release their hormones. The hypothalamic inhibiting hormones are going to instruct the anterior pituitary not to release its hormones. So basically, these are hormones that are going to control the anterior pituitary, but either by telling it produce your hormones or by telling it don't produce your hormones. So if we take a look at the axon terminals, which you could just see flashing, these hormones get secreted into a portal system. And so what you'll see is these hormones traveling down blood vessels from capillaries surrounding the axon terminals down to capillaries that are surrounding cells in the anterior pituitary. So here we go. Now the next thing that happens here is these hormones will diffuse out of the bloodstream and make contact with the anterior pituitary cells. And in this case, what I decided to diagram was the production of an anterior pituitary hormone, which you see in purple here. And what happens here is that these cells will then release their hormones into the bloodstream, which then delivers these to specific cells, tissues, and glands. So those, again, containing the receptors necessary to receive these signals. And for anterior pituitary hormones, this has the ability to affect a lot of different hormones, or a lot of different tissues and cells and organs. So thyroid stimulating hormone will cause the thyroid to produce its hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, will cause the adrenal cortex to produce its hormones. Prolactin will cause the mammary glands to produce milk. This, again, is different from oxytocin, which causes the release of milk once it's produced. It's prolactin that causes it to be produced in the first place. The anterior pituitary can also release FSH and LH, which are gonadotropic hormones, which will instruct the ovaries and testes to either produce sperm or mature ova, or they'll cause the ovary or the testes to release either estrogen and progesterone in the case of ovaries or testosterone in the case of testes. Growth hormone will cause basically the growth of bones and tissues and other cells around the body. And in the integument, melanocyte-stimulating hormone will cause the production of melanin by these melanocytes. And so we'll examine the specific action of each of these hormones a little later on in this PowerPoint.